The basement door was padlocked from the outside. I stood there in my son's house, staring at that lock, and I felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the February air still clinging to my coat. My son had been avoiding my calls for 5 weeks. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a paramedic in Sudbury, Ontario. I have seen things that would empty most people out. I know what it looks like when something is wrong. And standing in that hallway, looking at a padlock on a basement door in my own son's house, I knew. I just didn't know how bad wrong could get. His name is Kevin. He's 34. When he was small, he used to fall asleep in the truck on the way back from hockey practice, and I would carry him inside still in his gear, helmet and all, because I didn't want to wake him. I kept that image of him in my head for 30 years, kept it like a photograph in a wallet. Something you reach for when you need to remind yourself that life has been good to you. I should have looked at that photograph more carefully, because the boy I carried inside smelling like ice and cold air was not the man who put that lock on his basement door. My wife's name is June. We've been married 41 years. She grew up in Timmins, same as me. We met at the curling club when we were both 22, and she laughed at something I said, and that was it for me. Done. There was never anyone else after that laugh. June is 64. She has arthritis in both hands and she takes a blood pressure medication every morning. And she likes to do the crossword puzzle from the Globe and Mail before she gets out of bed. She is the most ordinary and essential person I have ever known. And I say that with everything I have. When Kevin called me on December and said his marriage was struggling, that he and his wife Brenda needed some time, that they were asking June to come stay with them for a few weeks to help with the grandchildren, I didn't think twice. June drove down to their place in Barrie on the second Saturday of December. She kissed me at the door and said she'd call when she got there. She called that evening. Said the drive was fine, the kids were happy to see her. Brenda seemed stressed but okay. Said she'd call the next morning. She didn't call the next morning. I told myself she was busy with the grandchildren. June can get absorbed. If the little ones need her, she forgets the phone entirely. I gave her until noon. Then I called her cell. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called the house line. Kevin answered and said Mom was out for a walk with the kids. She was fine. Probably just forgot to charge her phone. His voice was normal. Relaxed even. I believed him. I believed him for 3 weeks. Every few days he'd have a reason she couldn't come to the phone. She was napping. She was at the pharmacy. She'd taken the kids to Mariposa Market and left her phone on the counter. Small reasons. Ordinary reasons. The kind of reasons that feel embarrassing to question, because questioning them means you're the problem. You're the paranoid one. You're the old man who can't let his wife visit her son without making it into something. I am a retired paramedic. I know what I know. And somewhere around the 4th week, the knowing started getting louder than the embarrassment. I called my daughter-in-law's mother, a woman named Lorraine who lives in Aurelia. We're not close, but we are civil. The way in-law families are. I told her I was having trouble reaching June and asked if she'd heard anything. There was a pause on the line that lasted maybe 2 seconds too long. She said she hadn't spoken to Brenda in a few weeks either. That she'd been meaning to call. That pause. I've thought about that pause many times since. I drove down on a Tuesday in late January. I didn't tell Kevin I was coming. I told myself it was because I didn't want to make a fuss, didn't want to make him feel checked up on. But the truth is something in me already knew, that if I called ahead, there would be another reason, another delay, another ordinary explanation that would leave me standing in my kitchen in Sudbury feeling like a fool. It was a 2-hour drive. I stopped in Innisfil for a coffee I didn't finish. By the time I turned onto their street in Barrie, my hands were steady on the wheel. But my chest was not steady at all. Kevin's truck was in the driveway. Brenda's Subaru was gone. I rang the doorbell. No answer. I knocked. Nothing. I still had the spare key they'd given me 2 Christmases ago, the one Kevin had handed me with a grin and said, "For emergencies, Dad?" I stood on the porch for a long moment thinking about whether this qualified. Then I thought about June's voice on that last phone call 5 weeks ago. How she'd said the kids were happy to see her. How she'd sounded like herself. How much I missed that. I used the key. The house was quiet in the way that houses get when they've been quiet for a while. Not the quiet of people out for the afternoon. A deeper quiet of the afternoon. A deeper quiet. The kitchen was tidy. Too tidy. June always leave a tea mug on the counter. There was no tea mug. There were dishes in the drying rack and a child's drawing stuck to the fridge with a magnet. But something about the whole room felt like a stage set, like someone had arranged it to look like a normal kitchen. I called out. Nothing. I walked to the main floor. Living room, dining room, the little office Kevin uses for his accounting work. I went upstairs. The grandchildren's rooms were neat and empty. The master bedroom door was open and the bed was made. No sign of June in any room she would normally inhabit. I came back downstairs and that's when I saw the basement door. I had been in that basement before. Kevin finished it a few years ago, put in a rec room and a small guest space where June usually stayed when she visited. There was no reason for a padlock on that door. There had never been a padlock on that door. I stood and looked at it. The lock was a heavy-duty combination padlock, the kind you see on storage units. Not a small thing, not a temporary thing. Someone had installed a proper hasp on the door frame to hold it. I am 67 years old and I weigh 170 pounds. And I had a partial knee replacement 2 years ago. I am not a large man anymore, but I put my shoulder into that door twice, and on the second try the hasp pulled free from the frame and the door swung open and I nearly went down the stairs with it. I caught the railing, and then I heard her. It was a small sound, not a scream, not a call for help, more like a response to a noise, like an animal that's been very still for a very long time, and suddenly hears something and makes a small involuntary sound to answer it. It came from the bottom of the stairs, and it unmade me completely. I went down. The guest space at the back of the basement had been changed. The fold-out sofa was still there, and June was on it, covered with a blanket, and she turned her head toward the light from the stairwell, and she said my name and her voice came out wrong. Dry and thin, like paper that's been folded too many times. I don't have a keen memory of the next few minutes. I know I crossed the room. I know I took her hands. Her hands were cold and she was dehydrated and she had been down there in the dark and I could not for the life of me understand what I was seeing. There was a space heater in the corner, so she hadn't frozen. There was a case of water bottles on the floor and a box of granola bars and crackers. Enough to survive on, but not enough to be well. She had her phone, but Kevin had changed the password and disabled it so it wouldn't call out. She had knocked on the door. She had called out. No one came. I called 911. I remember being very calm on the phone. 31 years of training does something to you. You learn to split yourself in half. One part that functions and one part that feels. And you keep them separate until the work is done. The part of me that functioned told the dispatcher the address and described June's condition and said we needed an ambulance and police. The part of me that felt sat beside my wife on that fold-out sofa and held her hand and did not let go. The ambulance came in 9 minutes. The police came 4 minutes after that. I know the times because I counted. Kevin came home 40 minutes after the police arrived. I watched from the front window. He turned onto the driveway and saw the cruisers and the ambulance. And even from a distance I could see him go still in the front seat. He sat there for maybe 30 seconds before he got out. I watched his face when he walked toward the front door and saw me standing in it. It was not the face of a son who had come home to an emergency. It was the face of a man calculating. I stepped back to let the officers handle it. What came out over the next several days was this. Kevin and Brenda had been in serious financial trouble for over a year. Kevin had borrowed money against their house, against a line of credit. Against a second line of credit he'd taken out in Brenda's name without her full understanding of it. He owed amounts I will not repeat here, because they still make me feel sick. He had been servicing debt by pulling from other debt, the way people do when they're drowning and can't stop moving long enough to realize there's no shore in sight. June and I have a house in Sudbury that we own outright. We also have retirement savings, a pension from my years of service, and a small inheritance June received when her mother passed in 2019. It is not a fortune, but to a man drowning in debt, it looked like a life raft. Kevin's plan, as near as the police were able to reconstruct it, was to have June sign over power of attorney while staying with them. There had been talk about helping manage finances in her later years, talk that June had mentioned to me as something Kevin had raised, something she'd said she would think about when she didn't agree immediately, when she said she wanted to talk to me first. Things had changed. Brenda had left the house with the children about 10 days after June arrived. She told the police she hadn't known what was happening at first, that Kevin had told her June was confused and needed a quiet space. By the time she understood the full situation, she said she was frightened of Kevin in a way she hadn't expected to be frightened of her own husband. She had taken the children to her mother's in Aurelia and had not gone back. The pause on the phone when I called Lorraine. That was Lorraine knowing her daughter was gone but not knowing what to say. Kevin was arrested in my son's driveway on a Tuesday afternoon in January. He was charged with forcible confinement, fraud, and elder abuse under the criminal code. Brenda cooperated fully with investigators. The children stayed with Lorraine while everything was sorted out. I sat in the hospital waiting room at RVH Berry where they assessed June. A young nurse came out and said she was dehydrated and malnourished and had a mild respiratory infection from the damp, but that she was going to be alright, that she was asking for me. I walked into that room and June looked up at me and she had lost weight. I could see in her face and her hair was wrong and she had been frightened for 5 weeks in a basement. And she looked at me and said, I kept telling myself you'd come. I kept saying to myself, he'll figure it out. He always figures it out. I sat down beside her bed and I took her hand and I didn't say anything for a while because there was nothing to say that was equal to what she'd been through. I just held on. Kevin's case took 11 months to work through the courts. His lawyer argued diminished capacity due to financial stress and depression, and I will not pretend that part didn't complicate things for me. Because I know what depression is. I know what desperation does to people. I spent 31 years watching what crisis does to human beings, and I have never once believed that people who do terrible things are simply born terrible. There was a part of me, a very quiet part that I kept mostly to myself, that grieved for the boy in the hockey gear. That part never went away entirely. But there was also my wife. There was the image I cannot get out of my head of her lying on that fold-out sofa in the dark, listening for footsteps on the stairs, counting granola bars, saying to herself that I would figure it out. Kevin received a sentence of 3 years and 4 months, with eligibility for parole consideration after serving half. He was also issued a lifetime no-contact order regarding June. The fraud charges resulted in a separate civil proceeding that is still working itself through the system. June came home to Sudbury on a Thursday in February, 2 weeks after I found her. I had cleaned the house and put fresh sheets on the bed and bought the brand of tea she likes, the one from the little shop on Elm Street that she always says is too expensive and buys anyway. I had put the kettle on before I pulled into the driveway. She walked in the door and stood in the front hall for a moment, looking at everything, and then she went to the kitchen and poured her tea and stood at the window looking out at the backyard where the feeders needed filling and the snow was piled up against the fence. She said, "It's good to be home." I filled the feeders that afternoon. Chickadees came before I was even back inside. People ask me how I'm doing. Neighbors, old colleagues on the service, our family doctor who has known us both for 20 years. They ask with that particular gentleness that means they want to know but also want to be prepared for the answer. I tell them we are managing. I tell them June is stronger than I am in most ways that count, and that part has always been true. I tell them that some days are harder than others, that there are mornings when I wake up and reach for her in the dark just to confirm she's there, and that she always is. That she laughs sometimes at how often I do it. What I don't tell them is this. I went back to Kevin's house the week after the arrest with the police escort to retrieve June's belongings. I went down those stairs again in the daylight this time, and I stood in that basement guest space and looked at where she had been, and I thought about all the phone calls I had answered and believed and all the ordinary explanations I had accepted because it was easier to accept them. I know better now. I know that love, even the kind you've carried for 30 years, does not protect you from someone who has decided that what you have matters more than who you are. I know that the person who needs you most is not always the one asking the loudest. And I know that February in Ontario is cold and long and dark, and that there are chickadees who would come to a feeder if you keep filling it, and that June does her crossword in bed every morning now with her tea going cold on the nightstand, and that I've never once complained about how she leaves those mugs. I never will. I've had a long time now to sip with what happened. Long enough that I can look at it without my hands shaking, most days. What Kevin didn't come out of nowhere. I understand that now in a way I couldn't. In those first weeks after the arrest, when everything was still raw and I couldn't think about him without feeling something I didn't have a clean name for. Betrayal doesn't announce itself. It builds quietly over time, one small compromise at a time, one rationalization stacked on top of another, until the person doing it has traveled so far from who they were that they can padlock a door on their own mother and tell themselves it's temporary. It's necessary. It's just until things get sorted out. That's what greed does when it goes unchecked. It doesn't just take your money, it takes your judgment. It takes your conscience. It takes the part of you that knows the difference between a person and a resource. I think about what June told me in the hospital, that she had kept herself going by believing I would figure it out, that she had held onto that through 5 weeks of darkness and fear and not knowing. There is something in that I find both humbling and clarifying. She wasn't passive. She was enduring with her whole self, staying steady when steadiness was the only thing available to her. That kind of quiet endurance is not nothing. It is, in fact, one of the hardest things a person can do. To stay calm, to stay present, to not give up on the person who is coming for you. And I think about what it took for me to finally go. Not to drive, not to spare key, not to shoulder into the door. I mean, the moment I stopped making excuses for Kevin's explanations and started trusting what I actually knew. 31 years of walking emergencies teaches you that your instincts exist for a reason. Ignoring them because the alternative is uncomfortable is not kindness. It is a failure of attention. I had let weeks go by because I didn't want to be the difficult one. The suspicious father, the old man who couldn't trust his own son. That hesitation cost June 5 weeks. I carry that. What I've come to believe is this: the people who do harm to others are rarely the monsters they look like in hindsight. Kevin was a man who made choices, one after another, each one a little worse than the last. Each one made easier because he had stopped asking himself the question that actually matters. Is this right? Not is this legal? Not will I get caught? Not can I justify it? Is this right? The moment you stop asking that question honestly, you are already on your way somewhere you don't want to end up. And June. What can I say about June? She came home and stood in the kitchen and looked out at the backyard and said it was good to be home. That simplicity is a kind of wisdom I spent 41 years living beside without fully seeing. She doesn't hold court over what happened. She doesn't rehearse it. She does her crossword. She drinks her tea. She lets the chickadees remind her that ordinary life, tended carefully, is enough. I fill the feeders every morning now without being asked. It's a small thing. But I've learned that the small things are where everything real actually lives.